Bizarre Podcast.
Hello guys and welcome back to Bizarre Podcast. On today's episode I'm going to be delving into the Black Monk of Pontefract story. It is said to be the UK's most violent poltergeist case, and I had an absolute blast researching this. I loved every minute of it, and I hope you enjoy listening to it as much as I enjoyed researching it. So without further ado, I give you the Black Monk of Pontefract. Enjoy. Don't get too scared. 30 East Drive is the address of a rundown ex-council house which is said to be the most haunted house in all of the UK, and it sits inside a housing estate on the outskirts of Pontefract. Pontefract is a historic market town in the metropolitan borough of Wakefield in West Yorkshire, and according to historians, the town itself has a very dark history. The haunting of 30 East Drive first started way back in 1966. Either that, or it is the first time it was ever acknowledged. The house still stands today. In fact, if you're brave enough, you can actually pay to spend the night in the ex-council house in Pontefract. The man who now owns the house is a Mr. Bill Bungay, who just happens to be a film producer. And Bill actually made a movie about the haunting called When the Lights Went Out. I actually purchased the film in preparation for this episode, and I can tell you it is actually a very good movie. It's very creepy and scary. There are elements from this actual story in the film, but it's not necessarily 100% accurate to this story. Of course, for the sake of entertainment, it has been heavily dramatised, but it is still a very good, creepy, scary film, and I urge anyone to seek it out and watch it. So like I said, Bill is a movie producer, and at the time when he was working on this horror film, he was looking for a clever way to promote it. When all of a sudden, Bill had a great idea, a perfect way to promote this movie. He would simply buy the actual house. 30 East Drive. After all, it was empty and for sale, and more importantly, it was very cheap. It was dirt cheap. And so that's exactly what Bill did, and he decided to have a red carpet event at the actual house and show the movie to the media and two lucky competition winners. And well, it didn't go too well. The film didn't really take off straight away, although now it is considered a little bit of a cult classic. It didn't really take off straight away, and after the event was all over, Bill was left with a supposed haunted house on his hands. And you may be interested to know that Bill didn't believe the house was actually haunted. He just wanted to make a good horror movie based on a so-called real haunting. You see, Bill was a real skeptic. He didn't necessarily believe in ghosts or haunted houses or the paranormal in general. All that was about to change, because it wouldn't be long before the poltergeist that had been fairly dormant was about to wake up. But before we cover the activity in the house these days, let's first go back to 1966 when the Prichard family moved into 30 East Drive and the horror began. The Black Monk of Pontefract story starts way back in August of 1966 at 30 East Drive. The Prichard family consisted of Jean and Joe Prichard, their son Philip, who was 15 years old at the time, and daughter Diane, who was 12 years. The house is a very modest council house, nothing fancy or spectacular about it. Nothing like your usual haunted manor or grand house you would see in movies. This is simply a two-bed basic house that are not uncommon in the UK. In fact, that's possibly why the case is so terrifying to many, because it's relatable. It's a normal looking house, the same kind many people live in, so it's easy to imagine this happening to yourself in your own home. Like I said, it was August 1966 and the family had gone away to Devon for a holiday during the bank holidays. But Philip had decided he didn't want to go on holiday and he decided to stay behind, so Jean Prichard's mother came over to stay and look after Philip and the house. It was a sunny Thursday afternoon and Philip decided to take a book into the garden and read, leaving his grandmother alone in the lounge knitting. As Philip sat outside in the warm sun, his grandmother felt a strange chill in the room, and then as 11:30 AM approached, a strange gust of wind blew through the house, rattling windows and slamming doors. Philip came back into the house to investigate. Philip's grandmother asked if there was a wind getting up outside. Philip said no, it's actually quite calm. So Philip's grandmother shrugged it off and went back to her knitting, whilst Philip went into the kitchen to make them both a drink. 10 minutes later, he returned into the lounge, and he was shocked at what he saw. His grandmother was so busy with knitting that she was totally oblivious to a grey-white powder that she was totally submerged in, like chalk dust or talc powder. Philip brought the powder-like substance to his grandmother's attention, and they both peered up to the ceiling. The first thing they did was obviously trying to make sense of the whole thing. Their initial thought was that the powder was coming from the ceiling because the Prichards had just recently redecorated. It could have been a sound explanation, but in close examination it would seem the dust actually lay separate from the ceiling. The area near the ceiling was actually clear of this chalky, powdery substance. In fact, Philip recalled that when his grandmother stood, her head reached above the chalk dust that just lingered there in the air. Now at this point they weren't afraid, more like confused as to where it was coming from, so Philip's grandmother called her daughter Marie Kelly, who lived across the road, to come and have a look. When Marie arrived at the house, she was shocked to see this dust-like substance floating in the air. The dust had also settled all over the furniture, and it was also floating in the drinks that Philip had made, and Philip's grandmother had become covered head to toe in this white powdery substance. Now Marie went into the kitchen to grab a cloth to start cleaning when she slipped on the lino floor where a puddle of water had formed. But here's the strange thing about this puddle. Once this puddle was mopped up, it simply reappeared. And then, when it was mopped up once again, it simply reappeared once again, like there was a leak underneath the floor and this water was just coming up. And in fact, that's what they actually thought was happening. They thought that the water was simply coming up through the floor. So they pulled back the lino to find that the floor was bone dry, and yet the water still returned in neat, perfect little circles. Next door to 30 East Drive lived Enid Prichard, who was married to Joel Prichard's brother. Enid arrived at the scene after hearing all the commotion and went to find the stopcock underneath the sink. She turned the tap to off and hoped that the flow of water would now stop, but still the puddles kept appearing, and so a plumber was finally called, who, surprise surprise, couldn't find anything wrong. He couldn't find any leaks whatsoever. And eventually, after about an hour, the water stopped appearing and everyone returned to their homes quite confident that the strange occurrences had stopped happening, when in fact it had only just begun. Later that day at around 7 PM, the activity all started up again. As Philip's grandma went into the kitchen to make a cup of tea, she noticed that the worktops in the kitchen were covered in tea leaves and sugar, and the button on the tea maker was apparently flicking on and off, on and off, on and off, which made an awful mess all over the draining board. Probably out of pure confusion and desperation to explain what was going on, Philip's grandmother pointed the finger at him, to which Philip responded that it wasn't him. All of a sudden there was an almighty crash that came from the hallway. They both went to investigate, and as they opened the door that led into the dark hallway, the light clicked on all by itself. And then they noticed what made the crashing noise. It was a potted plant that normally sits at the bottom of the stairs, and now it was halfway up the stairs and it had actually left the pot itself. But the pot couldn't be found anywhere. Eventually it was located at the top of the stairs on the landing. Somehow it had managed to travel from the bottom of the stairs all the way to the top. As they stood staring at the pot, a loud vibrating sound came from the kitchen. It was a cupboard which held all the plates and cups. It was shaking violently on the wall. Philip grabbed the door to the cupboard and the shaking suddenly stopped, only to be replaced by another noise coming from elsewhere in the house. It was at this point I think they probably thought enough was enough, and they both fled the house, running across the road to the daughter Marie's house. When they arrived, they explained what had been going on at 30 East Drive, and still after some kind of rational explanation, they all ventured back over to the house to investigate. And when they got there, they found that the cupboard was once again shaking violently on the wall. Now, on the opposite side of the house lived a neighbour named Mrs. Mountain. The Prichards and Mrs. Mountain shared a wall. So naturally, their first thought was that Mrs. Mountain was doing something on her side of the house, maybe some housework, which was affecting their side of the wall and somehow shaking the cupboard with the plates and cups in. And so they went knocking on Mrs. Mountain's door to ask if she was responsible for the strange occurrences that were happening in their house. And to their horror, Mrs. Mountain simply said that she actually thought it was the Prichards making all the noise. When Marie, Philip and his grandmother returned to the house, the activity had stopped. After a while of nothing happening, Marie said she was going back home across the road to go to bed, and if anything else was to happen, they should go and get her immediately. Philip and his grandmother went to bed. They were exhausted, and they were ready for sleep. Now, I was wondering how they could possibly think about going to bed in that house at this stage, and the only explanation I can think of is that they were still trying to find a rational explanation for everything that was happening, and paranormal activity was simply being pushed to the back of the mind, maybe on purpose. As they got settled for the night, Philip's grandmother went into Philip's room to kiss him goodnight before she settled herself. As she went in to kiss him, she noticed that he was staring past her and over her shoulder. His eyes were wide and filled with fear. As she turned, she saw the wardrobe moving and shaking from one side to the other. In the book Poltergeist by Colin Wilson, he described it as a drunken man tottering and swaying from side to side. Philip and his grandmother didn't need any more persuading. They left the house right there and then and went across the road to her daughter's, and there they stayed the night. Once Philip and his grandmother had finally calmed down from the horrifying ordeal they had just gone through, they finally fell asleep in Marie's house. Marie and her husband Vic decided that they needed to investigate further. After all, sleep was not going to happen tonight. They were too curious as to what was happening in the house across the road. Now, one thing I must tell you is that Marie's husband was a rational man. He didn't believe in the paranormal or the supernatural. He believed there was a simple explanation to be found. And that is why Vic picked up the phone and rang the police. It wasn't long before 3 police officers arrived, and accompanied by Marie and Vic, they all entered 30 East Drive. The police initially thought there may be an intruder, and so they searched the house completely, checking for forced entry, looking in wardrobes, cupboards, under the stairs, under the beds, and eventually came to the conclusion that everything was fine, and they returned to the police station. And Vic and Marie returned home. But they were still not ready to give up on this. After all, Marie had also seen some strange things happening in that house, and she wanted answers. And then Marie had a thought. A little way down the street there lived a man named Mr. MacDonald who had an interest in the paranormal and the unexplained. She thought maybe he could help. But the hour was late. It was getting on to midnight at this point, and they wondered whether he would actually be awake or not. So they had a walk down the street, and they discovered that his living room light was still on, so it would seem that he was still up, and so they knocked at his house. Mr. O'Donnell opened the door, looking a little bit confused as to why these people were knocking at this time of night. But when they were given a chance to explain themselves, he didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat, locked up his house, and headed towards 30 East Drive. When they arrived at the house, it was all eerily quiet. And so they simply sat there in the house waiting for some kind of activity. As he sat there in the lounge, Mr. O'Donnell explained the differences between a ghost and a poltergeist. He explained that a poltergeist could be a manifestation of the mind. He believed young Philip was responsible for it, but Philip was across the street now and fast asleep. So they believed nothing much was going to happen that night, and at around 1:30 p.m, they all decided to call it a night. Nothing was happening. As they were getting ready to leave the house, Mr. O'Donnell left with one more bit of information on poltergeists. He told them that poltergeists do strange things like rip up photographs, but without Philip's presence, they agreed that nothing was going to happen tonight. The reasoning behind this, I believe, is that many people believe that poltergeists actually feed off the energy from children who have just gone into puberty, and normally it revolves around girls. You hear a lot of stories about poltergeists like feeding off the energy of young girls. But in this case, Mr. O'Donnell believed that it was actually Philip who was attracting the poltergeist, but as he was not in the house at the moment, they decided to leave. And with that, Mr. O'Donnell said goodnight and headed on home. As Marie and Vic switched off the lights, they were about to lock the door when they heard a massive crash coming from the darkness. They returned back into the house and switched on the lights to the lounge, and on the floor lay 2 small oil paintings that were face down, and glass from the frames lay scattered all around. And then they noticed a picture of Jean and Joe on their wedding day, which had been sliced all the way across it. It would seem that the ghost or the poltergeist had heard exactly what Mr. O'Donnell had said, and it would also seem that it was very much aware of everything. The next day, Philip and his grandmother returned to the house and all was quiet. Eventually, Jean and Joe Prichard and the young daughter Diane returned home from their holiday, and Philip and his grandmother couldn't wait to tell them everything that had happened while they'd been on their trip. Understandably, Jean and Joe Prichard didn't exactly believe any of it. They thought it was laughable. But Philip's grandmother, Jean's mother, was desperate for them to understand what had happened and desperate for them to know that it did happen and they weren't going crazy. So she went on to describe in detail what had happened that day when the cold wind blew through the house and the windows and the doors rattled and shook. And then she told Jean of the strange knocking that could be heard from the house. Jean asked what kind of knocks, and as she uttered these words, 3 very loud bangs rang out from somewhere in the